Dear guests and conference participants, more than 6 years after the convening of its earlier international academic conference in April 2016, the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan-Dearborn is happy to host yet another important gathering dedicated this time to the Soviet experience in Armenia and its legacy. The center staff began thinking of this conference around 2018. At the time, the centenary of the proclamation of independence in Armenia in the dying months of the First World War was being marked worldwide, both in the Republic of Armenia and across the Armenian diaspora. A few academic conferences were also scheduled in the diaspora as part of the centenary celebrations in 2018. We reasoned that some of the factors that generated its enthusiasm, especially in the diaspora, would be absent when the turn would come in 2020 to mark the 100th anniversary of the establishment of a Soviet system of government in Armenia, even though the 70 years of Soviet rule are also an important period in modern Armenian history that warrants further research. Therefore, we opted to accept the challenge and fill this expected gap. This decision was in line with the center's strategic choice, which is to organize a few large-scale academic conferences or exhibitions, usually within 3-year intervals, but to focus during these gatherings on topics which appear to be neglected by other, including larger Armenian studies centers and programs in the diaspora. Our initiative to convene a conference on the history and legacy of Soviet Armenia was greeted by all friends and colleagues in Armenian studies with whom we were in touch. Once the call for paper was issued toward the end of 2019, we were inundated with proposals from Armenia. However, we limited the number of invitees from Armenia to only half of the conference participants. We reasoned that, compared to the diaspora, there was more interest in studying the Soviet past in Armenia. We expected, therefore, that other academic gatherings would be organized in Yerevan in 2020 to mark the centenary. At the same time, we hoped that our conference would provide a unique platform for scholars outside Armenia to tackle this topic as well. Time proved our assumption correct. We ended up as the only Armenian Studies Center outside Armenia to organize a scholarly event to mark the centennial of Armenia's Sovietization. The invitations were being sent to the selected participants when the pandemic forced the closure of our campus from March 2020 to September 2021. Even during the following academic year, 2021-2022, many restrictions for using the facilities on campus persisted. Moreover, for Armenians worldwide, the difficulties of the pandemic were compounded by devastation caused because of the war launched by Azerbaijan against the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh in the fall of 2020. Nevertheless, the invited speakers were nearly unanimous not to hold the conference online, preferring to wait for better times to convene it in person. As we finally gather for this conference, the pandemic persists, but its lethality seems to have eased. However, the Damocles sword of the new full-scale war by Azerbaijan, this time against the territory of the Republic of Armenia, still hangs over all Armenians and appears bound to remain a threat for the country for the near future. The imposition of a Soviet system of government in Armenia in 1920 and Armenia's forced membership in the Soviet Federation split the Armenian diaspora at once. Some diasporans totally rejected Soviet rule, while others consented to offer it legitimacy and cooperate with it because they argued that it had finally brought durable peace to the nation not long after the traumas of World War I, genocide, and the ensuing political and military turmoil. From the 1920s to mid-1960s, being for or against the Soviet regime constituted the main line of political division across diasporan communities. Most organizations ended up being seen within one rival camp or the other. Even the Armenian Apostolic Church was affected, especially in the United States, where it practically stays divided since 1933 into two separate administrative structures, even though the latter maintain a common theology and religious traditions. These opposing attitudes toward the Soviets in Armenia persisted in the diaspora for 70 years until the Soviet Federation disintegrated and the dominance of communist ideology withered on their own in 1991. However, a noticeable mellowing of intra-diasporan political antagonisms had occurred by the mid-1960s, with the demands for international recognition of the Armenian genocide and restitution from Turkey gradually bringing rival factions closer. Under these changing circumstances, decades-old differences as regards the legitimacy of the Soviet regime in Armenia were pushed to the back burner. These sharp political antagonisms in diaspora until the mid-1960s had predictably generated an extensive polemical literature, not only in Armenian newspapers and periodicals, but also in the format of pamphlets and even full-length books. However, Armenian studies was not yet visible as an interdisciplinary area of academic research during this period. There were therefore very few academic studies on Soviet Armenia published in the diaspora during these decades. The intra-Armenian diasporic polemics on Soviet Armenia continued, albeit in a relatively milder tone, until the end of the Soviet era. However, the mood prevailing in the diaspora from the 1960s to the 1980s was aimed primarily at ensuring wide intra-Armenian cooperation on issues related to the Armenian genocide. The latter theme subsequently dominated research in the nascent domain of Armenian studies in North American and West European universities, marginalizing in the process popular interest in other important periods and topics in Armenian history, including the Soviet era. Moreover, attitudes toward the Soviet system were still an issue of contemporary political resonance in the diaspora from the mid-1960s to the late 1980s. Since there was still no commonly agreed diaspora interpretation of the Soviet role in Armenia, community leaders feared that too much academic and other public attention on the Soviet era may reignite undesirable intra-diasporic tensions as regard the system's legitimacy and jeopardize the joint effort towards genocide recognition. As Armenian studies developed in North American and European universities in the second half of the 20th century, there were still very few diasporan scholars who embarked upon an academic study of Soviet Armenia. Among those who pioneered mostly isolated efforts to study Soviet Armenia outside the latter's borders, mention should be made of Mary Kilborn-Matosyan, Ronald Suni, Claire Seda Muradian, and Manuel Sarkisians. However, the public mood stayed such that their efforts were not given publicity equal to that received by diasporan and other scholars outside Armenia who studied the Armenian genocide and other periods and topics in Armenian history. The most recent outbreak of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in 1988 predated the disintegration of the Soviet Union. It soon became a primary theme for Armenian scholarly attention in the diaspora. Rarely, however, has this understandable diaspora interest in Nagorno-Karabakh transcended into deeper curiosity concerning Armenia's Soviet past, even though much of the roots of this conflict can be traced to the peculiarities of Soviet society and politics. The large-scale emigration from Soviet and then independent Armenia since the mid-1970s has also not altered much the picture of relative public disinterest in the diaspora toward academic work conducted on Soviet Armenia, now also by a younger generation of scholars, most notably Dalinder Minasyan, Felix Corley, Arsen Saparov, Hachi Grafi-Gazer, and Joanne Laycock. The Armenian Research Center is holding this conference to reassert the importance of studying the Soviet period in modern Armenian history, not only by scholars living in the Republic of Armenia, the post-Soviet and post-communist countries, but also by their ethnic Armenian and non-Armenian peers based outside the former communist bloc. Primary tools, written, audiovisual, and oral, are abundant to study Armenia's Soviet past. They allow for thorough academic investigation via various research tools usually identified with different humanities and social science disciplines. Our conference covers almost all epochs of Soviet history: new economic policy, Stalinism, Nikita Khrushchev destabilization and the thaw, and the so-called era of stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev. Moreover, the conference is also multidisciplinary. The various papers to be presented are grounded in various disciplines, including intellectual history, sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, literature, education, architecture, urban planning, and religion. It is understandable that 16 papers will never be enough to analyze every aspect of the Soviet experience. Several domains are missing from our program, including economics, music, sports, and others. The study of Armenia's Soviet past also offers a lot for comparisons with similar experiences in other regions of the broader communist world. We would have welcomed more comparative studies for our conference had we received such proposals. Nevertheless, my sincere wish is still to see scholars dealing with the Soviet era in Armenian history introduce more comparative themes in their future analyses. This conference will also deal with the legacy of the Soviet past, including memory and memorialization in post-Soviet Armenia, and hopefully among Armenians overall in the world today. In the past 30 years, intellectual and popular perceptions of this legacy have been refined regularly. They also have an undeniable potential to continue changing, at least in the near future, as the post-Soviet space remains at present arguably the most explosive part of the world. Academics should and will hopefully keep this legacy under watch, for this is one aspect of Soviet past which continues to capture human imagination, particularly in the post-communist world. I want to inform that the substantial interest shown by scholars in Armenia toward this conference induced us toward thinking about another conference on this same subject, this time in Yerevan, and primarily in the Armenian language. In the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography at the National Academy of Sciences in Armenia, we have found a partner, and we have started planning to hold such a gathering in late spring 2023. We suggested cooperation to this institute because most applicants from Armenia to this conference in Dearborn were anthropologists. We promptly received an enthusiastic positive response from this institute. I personally thank in this regard its former director, Pavel Avedisyan, and his successor, the current director, Arsen Bobokhyan. Together, I hope we can make this projected conference in Yerevan a success too. For the present conference in Dearborn, I should express the center's gratitude to the Armenian Center at Columbia University and the Department of Armenian Communities at the Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation for their support. In Columbia's case, some participants in this conference will present their papers again during a public session to be held in New York City on Monday. Big thanks also go to the center staff and friends, Vahe Sahagian, Gerald Ottenbright Jr., and Anika Asparyan, without whose devotion and enthusiasm, the Armenian Research Center would have been unable to put together this ambitious gathering. Finally, I thank you for your presence this evening. I hope you will enjoy during the 3 days of the conference the papers to be delivered and the question and answer sessions which will follow the presentation of each of these papers. Thank you.